Hello everyone and welcome to this section, which is Spooky Studies. We're going to be looking at ethically questionable studies from the past and the present. I'm here with Helena Paterson. She studied her undergraduate and PhD at the University of Glasgow here and is now currently in the School of Psychology at University of Glasgow. She's teaching research methods and social psychology, but is also doing research into various topics surrounding stigma, such as children's gender stereotyping. An interesting fact about her is that she broke her wrist and is now part bionic, and her Halloween costume of choice would be Cruella de Vil. Hello and welcome. Thank you for taking part in the podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So you asked me to research a little bit more about spooky or scary studies. And when we discussed this first, I thought that it would be really interesting to look at some ethically questionable stuff. Things a little bit beyond Milgram and Zimbardo, which are things that people know very well, into some of the other questionable studies that have happened, ethically questionable studies that have happened in the past. So the first one I came across, and actually, you know, if you were to do a search for 20 worst psychology studies, I think you would probably find most of what I'm talking about today in terms of the history of psychology. But I thought I'd pair that with some of the more current stuff that's been going on in research and just see how they compare. So one of the first studies that I came across here when I was looking at this was has been dubbed the Monster Study. This was done in 1939 by Wendell Johnston and Mary Tudor. Now, Mary Tudor, not as in Queen Mary Tudor, but a girl called Mary Tudor who was doing her postgraduate studies. And it boils down to, they went to an orphanage, they wanted to induce stuttering in some children by telling them that they were stuttering, and then they didn't manage to do that. But what they did do was 5 of the children who were not stuttering and who they tried to induce the stuttering in became rather upset during the whole thing. The whole process changed the way that they felt about themselves and had consequences laid on into their lives. So I think for me this is a really good example of how you need to be careful of vulnerable populations. Now, I do research with children, and we try very hard not to coerce them into doing things that they don't want to. Even when a parent gives permission, you still need to make sure that the child agrees. But there's also other things in this one, which was just the idea of positive and negative therapy. People might have heard about the little Albert experiment by Watson before this, which was the same kind of thing. Inducing somebody to feel fear or worry or bad about themselves. Now, this was a long time ago, and people would say maybe this kind of thing doesn't happen anymore, but that doesn't stop us from having to take care that it doesn't.
Yeah, it's really important that we look at these kind of studies and understand the consequences that it had on the children and look at how we can try and do research better than that.
And also, I think the other thing that this made me think about was the power of the scientist, because they went to the authorities. It was in Ohio in the USA. They went to the authorities and they asked for permission to go into this orphanage. An orphanage that housed, I think, something like 300 children. They only studied 22 of those, but the orphanage was obviously willing for these people to go in and study the children there. There's other studies. So, for instance, Bandura's studies was done not in exactly the same way, but in a similar way that where he did it, they actually... sorry.
No, don't worry.
It's not the Bandura, sorry. The Marshmallow Study was done maybe with similar kind of things. Have you ever heard of the Marshmallow Study?
Yes, yeah.
Well, one of the things there was that the university they did it at had a nursery attached to the psychology department where people would take their children for childcare. But part of the thing was that the children would be studied as well.
Right, that was part of the agreement with the parents.
I as far as I know, yeah. So it might be worthwhile double checking the facts there. But the idea that you would take your child, you would drop them off at nursery for the day, and then they would become one of these experimental participants. And really, what choice does that child have? If it's cheap childcare, what choice does that parent have in dropping the child off and doing that kind of thing? So those kinds of things slightly fill me with horror, that you would let somebody inexperienced loose on a population like that who doesn't really necessarily always have a choice in what they want to say. Similar things that can happen or that have happened in the past is that people become really, people who have children or who are themselves suffering from medical conditions or learning disabilities might want to take part in research because they want to help out. They want to find out more about their condition. And this is kind of like an underlying contract that you almost make with that participant, that you're going to give them some good news. That kind of diagnosis or that kind of diagnostic thing, as psychologists, we need to steer clear of as well. It's not necessarily a good idea to say to somebody, well, you have this particular learning disability or difficulty, and we have this theory that we're working on, and that really explains things about your disability.
That could be really harmful as well for, obviously, the people who are expecting some kind of solution, because the researchers, although I'm sure every researcher wants their research to be useful and applicable, that puts even more pressure on the researchers to make their research have a clear finding or some kind of applicable result, which could lead to even more heightened research bias when they're doing, with the best intentions, when they're doing data analysis.
And the other thing is, it takes us 4 years to just scratch the surface in terms of learning about research methods with our undergraduate students. You're expecting somebody who walks in the door, who maybe has never studied psychology, who's not very conversant in research methods, to understand the idea that you're working on a theory, that a theory isn't fact, and that the scientific process means that you're never going to study fact. You're always going to be looking for something that could be disproven at another date. And this is not something that a lot of lay people are conversant with. So they look at you as a scientist and the power that you have to be able to explain to them some of the things that they're interested in.
And then it's also it is also outside of the control of scientists, because even if you do absolutely everything right in your study, then the media can completely take it, or hopefully not, but often so many studies are taken out of context. And like with the Marshmallow Study you were talking about earlier, even though I'm sure the researchers hoped it would have some kind of impact and be useful in daily life, that was so picked up and used. I'm sure that affected the children in the study, because they would have remembered taking part and then seen all of these conclusions drawn about their future and how that was going to affect them. And it
but it's not even just that. It's like, if you watch the movies of the Marshmallow experiment, some of them are in cognitive pain. It's not a comfortable situation. They want it. They can't have it. There's an opportunity to steal it. And there's actually a lot of opportunities that people put in children's way for stealing stuff. And another one that I wanted to talk about was a study by Denier and colleagues in 1976. Very appropriate to this theme. It was a Halloween study. It was they did this in Seattle, and one Halloween evening in 27 homes in Seattle, they ran different conditions of an experiment. So the kids would come to the door expecting tricking and treating, and they didn't know that they were being secretly filmed. Part of the point of the study was to show that when kids were wearing masks or they were not individuated, you couldn't tell their name and you didn't know anything about them, that they would steal sweets. And in other cases, when they were known, that they might not do this. And so they basically put temptation in these kids' way. They walked out the room saying, you can only have one sweet, and then they would go away. And there would be the kid tempted to take more studies. Now, this had over 3,000 participants. This had over 1,000 participants. 1,352 children took part in this study. And nobody had given permission that they would be part of that. I don't know even if their parents had agreed that the kids could take part. This was randomly kids who turned up at the door for tricking and treating were used as participants. And is that right? is that wrong? It's shown something very interesting about de-individuation. It shows something very interesting about de-individuation in children. But again, it's putting children into temptation's way, asking them to do stuff that, yes, maybe they would normally do, but that isn't scrutinized to quite that extent.
Yeah, it's also difficult because you're sort of presenting a situation which would normally be completely unacceptable, and then maybe if the children did it and saw later that it was all part of a study, that could create an impression that maybe it's more acceptable than.
I mean, they were quite open about the date and stuff. I'm always surprised. I've not really looked into newspaper reports at the time or anything like that. But nowadays, if this were to happen, you would have outcry in the national press. They use our kids in Halloween studies, and they didn't tell them that it was going to be, and they made them steal stuff. You know, because the other thing as well is there's other research to show about how cheating in exams, another secret filming study, but how kids would cheat in exams, and then later on their opinions about cheating would change.
Yeah.
So actually you're putting kids into temptation's way. You're giving them this opportunity to do this behavior that they might or might not actually experience at some other time. And then there's other research to show that if you do this, you're actually going to change that person's opinion about stealing or cheating or doing the bad stuff in future. And to me, those are horror stories, you know, worthy of Halloween and Frankenstein's lab, really, that you can potentially mess with your participants. So it's worthwhile thinking, is it really worth doing that? And if you do that, how are you going to debrief participants? How are you going to tell them about this afterwards? And are you going to make sure that you do?
Yeah, and I'm obviously those children, if they didn't know that they were being observed, they probably didn't get any kind of debriefing or any understanding or knowledge of how they'd been involved in an experiment.
Yeah. The other one, which is kind of related to this, is actually something a little bit more modern, which is the Facebook's emotional contagion study. And this one did make it to the media. They didn't, I mean, I don't know. My personal opinion is that I don't think they did something so horrendous, mostly because they found a very small effect. They found hardly any effect of what they did. But more it is the research methods that they used, which is that they randomly allocated 700,000 English-speaking users of Facebook in a week into two conditions. One in which they selectively removed positive statements from, or positive words from, or posts with positive words. So some things on their timeline with positive stuff. And for the other group, they removed some things on their timeline with negative stuff. And so one group would have more positivity maybe on their timeline, you can think about it, and one group would have more negativity. And then they analyze people's posts. Now, this is one of the things that have broken people's trust in social media, in big companies that have social media. Now I think you go into the world knowing if you're signing up for a social media account, you're pretty much signing up for whatever they're going to want to do with you. This is something that maybe, you know, and maybe the horror story there is that we've come to accept that kind of thing. And so we want to use these products, and so we're going to subject ourselves to whatever they deem is going to be appropriate. And sometimes people don't have a choice. You know, your friends are all on Facebook, so you want to be on Facebook. Or your friends are on WhatsApp, you want to be on WhatsApp. Or your friends are on Twitter, so you're going to be on Twitter. Your teacher, like in our school, your teachers are on Twitter. We encourage people to do that. One good thing about Twitter is that you don't have to have an account. You can actually just look up the stuff without having to have an account. You can't do that in most of Facebook.
Yeah, I know lots of students who actually didn't have Facebook before coming to university, but because it's such an integral part of, well, for my social group anyway, how we plan events and how we talk to each other, we use it to communicate. You miss out on a lot if you're not on Facebook, so lots of people have signed up. And now they're going to be subjected to all of the things that you've been talking about. And
there aren't a lot of really good alternative solutions. You know, there's companies are about making money, and I think the thing that happens is that nothing is offered for free. My concern is more when some of that offering for free comes part of the, well, you're going to be lab rats in our experiments. What I found scariest about that study is obviously it was completely randomly allocated, and Facebook couldn't have known how vulnerable each group was before the experiment started. And for a particularly vulnerable person, like maybe someone suffering from depression,
that could have really had an effect on them, and Facebook wouldn't have thought, well, maybe they would have considered that kind of thing, but that's a really important factor in the implications of this research, because it could have, they didn't know what the effect size was going to be when they started it, and although it did have a small effect size, it could, I suppose, have had a really big one, and then they would have subjected all of those people to that consequence without having their permission. So,
and they called it marketing research, and to me that kind of is like it's product marketing and stuff like that. I wasn't sure exactly how this kind of emotional manipulation was, it was never clear, or it's not obvious. Maybe if you go read a little bit more deeply into it and stuff, and into the papers and things like that, you would find out exactly how this is related to marketing. But it almost seems like one of these studies where you try to see what would happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. The final thing I wanted to talk about, while we still have a fair bit of time, I think, is about a study about obedience. Now, I think we've all heard about the stuff that Milgram did, his experiments where he coerced people into shocking other people, even though they didn't really shock them, so he deceived them into that. But long before Milgram, there was Carney Landis. Now, you told me that you hadn't heard about Carney Landis before.
I didn't think so.
But it's one of these studies that you would find quite easily if you went for a search on the internet. And I find this one a really interesting one because I study emotion as well. Emotion is one of the things that I've studied in the past and that I continue studying now. And he was looking for universal facial expressions. Now, this was first postulated by Darwin, the idea that when you express your emotions, other people and animals can understand it. You all have the very similar expression of emotion, and that you'll be able to capture this in something like a picture. And he had some pictures, he had some drawings actually, in his book. Originally. So ever since he had postulated that, and Darwin's influence was quite major at the time and still is very important. But ever since he had postulated that, people were looking for new ways in which to do this. And Landis came up with this really, actually, pretty good idea. I have to say, I'm really impressed by it. But he was going to get people to experience emotions, and then he was going to photograph them. He was going to take some physiological measures, and he was going to photograph their faces. And really, he wanted genuine emotions. So looking through the list of... so what he did was he brought them into his lab. They set them up in this complex apparatus, and they drew lines on their faces so that they could take pictures and see the different parts of the faces or how it works. And then he subjected them over a 3-hour period to a range of different scenarios that would elicit emotion. And it starts simply with things like, I'm getting this from the paper. The paper is really a nice read, one of these traditional psychology style research reports that you can get. So first of all, it's like popular music, and then technical music, and it goes on reading a bit from the Bible, telling a truth and a falsehood, so telling a lie and a truth and taking photos then. And then smelling ammonia, so a bad smell. And then it gets a little bit worse. So one is a faux pas. The subject was given a sheet of paper and a pencil and told to write a full description of the meanest, most contemptible, or the most embarrassing thing they ever did. Try to describe some event which still disturbs you even to think about it. And guess what they did then? They wrote that out. They read that out to them. So the researcher read that out to them. And so, how could you be more embarrassed, somebody reading out your worst thing that they've just told you to do to them?
And I'm sure they didn't expect to have to share that kind of information when they signed up.
I don't know. I don't know how much the participants knew, but so the one thing about the participants here were that they were other graduate students. So they had about 22, 23 people, and most of them, all the men in the study, so half of them were men and half of them were women. All the men were psychology graduate students, so other people similar, people working in psychology, and half of the women, more than half of the women were as well. So they had very few lay people in here. So I'm pretty sure that these subjects had talked to each other and they knew what was going on. So it might not have been quite a coercion in that. The one thing they didn't manage to get was laughter. So they try to tell jokes, and they abandoned that after the first subject because they couldn't get them to laugh.
Right.
So it was mostly just negative emotions represented here. But then they had also pictures of bad things. They also had them do complicated mental mathematics while listening or while being distracted, so a kind of like concentration phase. And then it goes on to showing them pornographic pictures, having them read sex histories. Several of the most pornographic of the case histories from Ellis, the psychology of sex, as well as several other brief case histories were given to the subject with the instruction, read over these case histories. And then putting their hand in frogs, and in a bucket of frogs, and receiving an electric shock. A few shocks as well. But I think the worst thing came right at the end. And I'll just read out to you what they did. So scenario 15, rat. The table in front of the subject was covered with a cloth. A flat tray and a butcher's knife were placed on the cloth. A live white rat was then given to the subject. He was instructed, hold this rat with your left hand and then cut off his head with the knife. Ugh. This situation was tried with 21 subjects. 15 subjects followed the instructions after more or less arguing. In 5 cases where the subjects could not be persuaded to follow directions, the experimenter cut off the head with the subject looking on. In 2 cases, the decapitation for various reasons was not performed. I think possibly when the person became too distressed. But the fact was that out of the 21 subjects, 15 did this. And I think this is, so rather than all the other stuff, I mean, I think maybe the side point of this was that the expressions that he elicited showed that when they showed them in other experiments to different participants, people couldn't tell what the expressions were. Okay, so they elicited all these expressions. A lot of the stuff was just blank faces, and so obviously, but these are situations when people would be experiencing obvious distress, and yet their facial expressions didn't necessarily show this. But more, I think what people look towards this is the idea that out of the 21 subjects, 15 actually did go ahead and decapitate the rat, despite the fact that they had no training in doing this. They didn't know how to do this in a humane way, and it was a distressing experience.
Yeah.
So, not
It's
good
horrible,
stuff.
Yeah. I can't imagine having to do that. And especially if you're kind of a peer of the person doing the research, you'd want to help them and might feel pressured to sort of carry on with the research the whole way. But
yeah, this whole peer thing, getting your friends to do your studies or getting other people to do it, or I don't know whether these might have been undergrad or these might have been students, and so they would want to be seen to be performing for the researcher.
Yeah.
I don't know how much they felt that they could leave the situation.
Yeah. Oh, the poor rat as well. Got to consider
and also the rats.
Yeah,
I mean,
being
we haven't done
decapitated.
animal research. There's a whole host of those which I didn't think we would go into today. But one of the things about the Carney and I think for me the most interesting thing about this is just that you can get your friends to do stuff for you. And I was part of a study, nothing this horrible, but I was part of a study when I was a postgraduate student. I did something for my friend. Which is about superstitious perception, so very appropriate for your podcasts. And superstitious perception is really interesting. He showed me lots of white noise, and he told me to find to let him know when there's a smile in the white noise. And then from this you can construct somebody's mental representation of the thing that you're interested in. He also did this with the letter S, with some other people, and then since then other studies in reverse correlation. The technique is called reverse correlation. Other studies in reverse correlation have shown other things like this, and it's a way of getting at somebody's cognitive or mental representation of something. Basically in their mind and thoughts that you wouldn't otherwise get access to. But it took 20,000 trials, which they split into 41-hour-long sessions. So I sat for 40 hours looking at a little patch of noise, occasionally seeing what I thought was a ghostly smile, and reporting that. And the study itself, so this is something that you would do in psychophysics. You would sit for ages in front of a screen and look at things. But it was very difficult to leave that study. You know, it was kind of, I was doing it for my friend. The thing with something like this is if I had abandoned it halfway through, then that would be his data lost and he would have to find somebody else again. So there wasn't really, the way that I would now work is I would really be very careful, and I would say to people, you can leave whenever you want to and things like that. And I would really, really listen to them when I see people became distressed. But when you're doing something like that, it's not really possible. And yet, it moved the field on quite a lot. Recently, just last year, there was a review of reverse correlation techniques that now show different ways, and they talked about different ways that you can do this, that you don't need 200,000 trials or 20,000 trials or whatever it was, that you don't need a subject to sit there for 40 hours to do it. But at the time, it was my mood got pretty low.
Yeah, I can imagine having to, and it's a really repetitive task, so you have to sit and do exactly the same thing.
40 boring hours lost forever.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like solitary confinement. All you get to do is do that for 40 hours. So,
well, you can know that you helped progress the field quite a lot.
Yep, you can feel that. And things like that. And I think the last thing I wanted to talk about is just so these are all studies that in one way or another advance things. People got fairly worthwhile things out of it, and you wouldn't do them again.
Yeah.
You wouldn't, like Landis stuff, you wouldn't do again. Other people have done similar things where they made people feel embarrassed and took photos of them, or they took photos of people's reactions of horror and things like that. So secret filming and stuff like that. But one study, which I think is probably my current horror study, is this study that broke science. And this is a study that was performed by I think his name is Harold Bem, and Bem was or is a really respected and famous social psychologist. He in fact wrote a seminal paper on how to write in psychology, which we don't give students anymore, because one of the things that it does is it perpetuates questionable research practices. But the thing that Bem did here was that he did 10 years worth of experiments and research to find that ESP exists. And he published this paper, meticulous methodology, clear statistical analysis. However, the conclusion of all that very clear research and that really clear scientific methodology was that ESP exists. So now you have a choice. You can either accept that ESP exists because the science says so, or you can say, does ESP really, really exist? Which means that the science is broken.
Yeah.
And this, along with some other things that happened at the time, Diederik Stapel around that time also is a famous case of making up data, and it was in the media.
And he was a very respected researcher and teaching at a university.
Yep, he was a very, very respected, and a high profile researcher. He took all the blame for that. He had made up the data, and he was very clear. He's written a book about it, explaining it later and things like that. But that was happening around the same time. At the same time as this study by Bem came out, and that really sparked for psychologists a need to look at their methodology. We're now 6 years later, and I think things have moved on quite a lot, but it has been a very difficult 6 years.
Yeah.
And I think my worst horror is ever finding the study that breaks science or doing the study that breaks science again.
Well, hopefully these horrors can be a thing of the past and not have to be carried on into the future. But thank you so much for coming and telling us about all of these spooky studies.
Yep, you're welcome.
And we hope you have a very happy Halloween.
I will do.
Thank you for listening to the first researcher interview of Psych Soc O'Clock. This interview was conducted by Amelia Hilton and Helena Paterson. It was produced and recorded by Amelia Hilton in association with the University of Glasgow Psychology Society, with special thanks to Sonia Kilman for the original music, and to the School of Critical Studies at the University of Glasgow for providing the recording facility. Keep an eye on the Psychology Society's Facebook to see when the next episode is coming out. But in the meantime, we hope your Halloween is filled with treats instead of tricks.